Michelle Pfeiffer is in the middle of a career resurgence and stars in not one but two upcoming TV series, and she credits her husband, David E. Kelley, for supporting her. Michelle told Entertainment Tonight, "I think we both know that I've put in my time, and now it is my time."
After nearly 40 years, John Malkovich finally speaks about the affair that shook two marriages. There are stories Hollywood never quite lets go of, and this is one of them. For decades, one detail sat quietly behind the glamour of a celebrated 1988 film, a rumor about two co-stars, two marriages that collapsed in the same year, and a silence that neither of them ever broke. Then, in the fall of 2025, one half of that story finally opened his mouth. What he said didn't confirm every whisper that had circulated for almost 40 years, but it came closer than anyone expected. And the other half of the story, the woman at the center of it, has still, to this day, said nothing at all. By the late 1980s, Michelle Pfeiffer was already one of the most in-demand actresses working in film. She had turned heads in Scarface, charmed audiences in The Witches of Eastwick, and was on the cusp of the run of performances, Married to the Mob, The Fabulous Baker Boys, Batman Returns, that would come to define an entire era of her career. John Malkovich, meanwhile, had already earned an Academy Award nomination for Places in the Heart in 1985 and had built a reputation as one of the most intense, unpredictable, and formidable actors of his generation, a performer whose stage-trained intensity translated into a screen presence that was impossible to ignore. Both were, by any measure, at high points in their professional lives when they were cast opposite each other. Neither could have known that a supporting role in a period drama about seduction and betrayal would end up shadowing both of their personal histories for the next 4 decades. To understand why this story has such staying power, you have to go back to where it started, the set of Dangerous Liaisons. Released in 1988, the film was an adaptation of an 18th-century French novel about manipulation, seduction, and the games powerful people play with each other's hearts. Director Stephen Frears assembled a cast that included Glenn Close, John Malkovich, and Michelle Pfeiffer, and the film went on to earn 7 Academy Award nominations. Malkovich played the Vicomte de Valmont, a calculating libertine who sets out to seduce a virtuous married woman, played by Pfeiffer's character, Madame de Tourvel. On screen, the two actors spent months building a relationship defined by pursuit, resistance, and eventual surrender. It was the kind of role that asks performers to live inside intense emotional intimacy for the length of an entire shoot, and sometimes, that intimacy doesn't stay contained to the frame. At the time, both actors were married. Pfeiffer had wed television writer and producer Peter Horton in 1981, and by most accounts theirs was one of the quieter, steadier partnerships in Hollywood. Malkovich, meanwhile, was married to actress Glenn Headley, a fellow member of Chicago's Steppenwolf Theater Company, the ensemble that also produced actors like Gary Sinise and Joan Allen. Malkovich and Headley's relationship wasn't just a marriage, it was rooted in a shared artistic history that went back years. Both actors, in other words, had something real to lose. And lose it they apparently did. By the end of 1988, the same year Dangerous Liaisons hit theaters, both marriages had ended. Director Stephen Frears himself later told the New York Times, in a 2003 profile, that Malkovich's marriage was breaking up while he was involved with Pfeiffer during filming, and that reality and the film's themes of betrayal seemed to intersect. That's a striking thing for a director to say on the record, and for years it stood as close to a confirmation as the public had. But neither Pfeiffer nor Malkovich addressed it directly. For decades, whenever the subject came up, both simply declined to engage, not confirming, not denying, just moving past it. In an industry where publicists carefully manage every word, that kind of prolonged mutual silence tends to read as its own kind of statement. It's also worth understanding why a rumor like this manages to survive for nearly 40 years in the first place. Hollywood productions are small, contained worlds for months at a time, and crew members, journalists on set visits, and industry insiders talk long after the cameras stop rolling. When a film built around themes of illicit desire and moral consequence produces real-life fallout between its two leads, the irony practically writes the headline itself. Add to that the fact that both marriages ended within the same narrow window, and it's easy to see why tabloids of the era connected the dots as aggressively as they did, even without either actor saying a word. For decades, the story lived in that uncomfortable space between persistent rumor and unconfirmed fact, kept alive mostly by its own symmetry rather than by any new information. 4 years, that's where the story sat. A suspected affair, a director's offhand confirmation, 2 divorces with suspicious timing, and 2 very private people who refused to discuss any of it. That changed in September 2025, when Malkovich, now 71, appeared on Bella Freud's podcast, Fashion Neurosis. Roughly 25 minutes into the conversation, he brought up his history with Pfeiffer largely unprompted, and what followed was the most extensive comment either of them has ever made on the subject. He began by acknowledging that this simply isn't something he discusses. He explained that in his line of work, people form emotional bonds with each other very quickly, that it's part of the job, and that only rarely do those bonds spill over into something more personal. It was a careful, almost clinical way of describing what happened, but it was also, notably, the first time he had said anything at all. He didn't deny that a relationship had developed. He didn't dismiss the rumors as tabloid fabrication. He simply described, in his own measured language, how these things can happen on a film set. What made the moment resonate even more was how he talked about Pfeiffer specifically. He described her as someone he valued greatly as a colleague, someone who was fun and moving to work with, and, by his account, incredibly fair to him. Then he added something more pointed, that he himself had not been fair in return. That admission is worth sitting with. He wasn't asked to grade his own conduct, and yet he volunteered that verdict anyway. It's not a confession of infidelity spelled out in dramatic terms, but it is a man taking some responsibility for how things ended between them professionally, if not necessarily for the affair itself. The most quoted part of his comments, though, was his reflection on what he lost. Malkovich said that he'd come to learn, over the course of his life, that finding a genuinely great colleague is rarer than people realize. And he suggested that once a working relationship crosses into something more than collegial, even into a profound friendship, you risk losing that colleague altogether. He allowed that this might be a flaw in his own psychology, or simply inexperience, but the conclusion he drew was consistent. Crossing that line cost him something valuable. Read one way, this is Malkovich mourning the collapse of a great professional partnership. Read another way, it's about as close as he has ever come to publicly acknowledging that the affair happened and that it wasn't worth what it cost him. It's worth pointing out what he didn't say, too. He never named a specific timeline, never described the relationship in explicit detail, and never used the word affair himself in the clips that circulated. Outlets covering the interview, including HuffPost, the New York Post, and several entertainment sites, characterized his remarks as an admission, largely because of how directly he tied the collapse of a valued professional bond to something becoming more than collegial. But readers should know the difference between a public figure using careful, suggestive language about a widely reported rumor and a detailed, explicit confession. Malkovich gave us the former. It was significant specifically because he had never given us anything before. Later in that same podcast conversation, he offered an interesting point of contrast. He talked about his decades-long professional relationship with actress Ingeborga Dapkinate, with whom he has worked on multiple projects across more than 3 decades, and he noted that the two of them have remained close friends and collaborators precisely because, in his words, there's a line that was never crossed. It's a small detail, but it says something about how Malkovich has come to think about his career and his relationships in hindsight, as though the Pfeiffer situation became something of a cautionary tale he carries with him. So where does that leave Michelle Pfeiffer in all of this? Exactly where she has always been, silent. She has never addressed these rumors in any interview, never confirmed anything, and never issued a denial either. That consistency matters. Pfeiffer is widely regarded as one of the more thoughtful and deliberately private actresses of her generation. She gives interviews selectively and has spent decades building a public image that is warm without ever being an open book. Her silence here isn't the silence of someone caught off guard. It reads as the silence of someone who made a decision decades ago and has never once wavered from it. It's important to be precise about something here, because a lot of headlines have blurred this distinction. Pfeiffer has not admitted anything. The recent development belongs entirely to Malkovich. What we have is one side of a decades-old story finally speaking, in careful and somewhat abstract terms, while the other side continues to say absolutely nothing. Treating that as a mutual confession overstates what actually happened. It's an important distinction, and one that respects both what has been reported and what remains, quite deliberately, unconfirmed by the person who would need to confirm it. In the years following Dangerous Liaisons, both actors rebuilt their personal lives in very different directions. Pfeiffer married television and film producer David E. Kelley in 1993, and the two have remained together for more than 3 decades, raising 2 children together while keeping their family life largely out of the press. Professionally, the years that followed the film produced some of the most memorable work of her career, including her Golden Globe-winning turn in The Fabulous Baker Boys, her performance in Batman Returns, and more recently, roles within the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Malkovich, for his part, has been in a long-term relationship with Nicoletta Peyron, with whom he shares 2 children, and has spent much of his life since then working across Europe on an eclectic mix of film, theater, and international productions. Glenn Headley, his former wife, went on to a successful career of her own, including a memorable role in Dirty Rotten Scoundrels, before her death in 2017. Peter Horton continued working steadily in television as well. It's striking, looking back, how differently these 2 actors chose to carry the same period of their lives forward. Pfeiffer has spoken warmly in interviews over the years about the importance of family and privacy, and by most accounts she has guarded her second marriage and her children from the kind of scrutiny that once surrounded her first. Malkovich, for his part, has followed a career path that seems almost designed to avoid easy categorization, from award-nominated dramatic roles to the strange self-referential comedy of Being John Malkovich, a film whose entire premise plays with the idea of what it means to actually be him, to decades of stage and film work across Europe that kept him largely removed from the Hollywood press machine that once covered his personal life so closely. In hindsight, both of their post-1988 choices look like a kind of quiet response to the same event. One retreated further into privacy, and the other kept working in places where nobody was quite as interested in his marriage. What makes this story endure isn't really the affair itself. Plenty of on-set relationships happen and fade without becoming cultural footnotes. What makes it endure is the particular tension between 2 people who lived through the exact same moment and chose 2 completely different relationships to silence. One chose total, unbroken silence for over 3 decades. The other chose to say almost nothing for just as long, and then, on a podcast in his early 70s, allowed himself one careful, oblique moment of reflection, not really about romance, but about the professional cost of it. That's a very Malkovich way to finally address something, analytical, understated, and more concerned with what was lost as a collaborator than with relitigating what happened as a couple. There's also something worth noting about how these stories get told today versus decades ago. In 2003, it took a director speaking to a major newspaper to put even a hint of confirmation on the record. In 2025, it took an actor sitting across from a podcast host, speaking candidly for over an hour, to finally say something close to the truth in his own words. No publicist statement, no scripted press junket answer, just an older man reflecting honestly on a choice he made when he was young and how it shaped the rest of his working life. That shift says something about how public figures now engage with their own histories, often more openly and on their own terms, long after the tabloids have moved on to other subjects. Whether Michelle Pfeiffer will ever add her own perspective to this story remains an open question, and given her history, it wouldn't be surprising if she never does. Her silence has already outlasted the marriage it followed, outlasted the media cycles that tried to crack it, and outlasted nearly every other detail of the Dangerous Liaisons era except the film itself. If anything, that consistency has become its own kind of statement, proof that not everyone who lives through a tabloid-ready moment feels obligated to eventually explain it. For now, what we have is one voice, speaking carefully after decades of quiet, and one continued, deliberate silence from the other side of the story. A silence that, 37 years later, still says exactly as much as it always has.